All right, so we know now how companies actually, legally carry out the dividend payment process. What's their other option is to do a share repurchase. And so I'll just introduce share repurchases here, and then later in the chapter, we'll talk about why companies do them, how do they do them, advantages and disadvantages to doing them, impact on stock value if I do a cash dividend versus a repurchase. But for now, we'll just say that, look, a stock repurchase or a share repurchase occurs, it says, when a firm basically purchases its own stock that it had previously issued. I should say issued, not issue. My typing, I don't always proofread well. These shares are referred to, it says, as treasury stock. Okay, so if I issue shares, right, we say the company has so many shares outstanding, which means they're not in the hands of the company, right? They are in the hands of shareholders out in the wild kind of thing. Now, whenever I want to take some of that back, right, because stock doesn't have a maturity, well, if I want to take some of that stock back, I go out and I repurchase it. Now, we're going to see that repurchases are often viewed as very good signals to the market. Why? Because companies should only repurchase their stock when it's undervalued, right? Because undervalued means it's cheap. Overvalued means it's expensive. Well, if I go out and purchase my own stock when it's expensive, I should be fired and never allowed to make a financial decision again, kind of thing, right? I should only go out and purchase my stock when it's cheap. And so stock repurchases send a pretty strong positive signal to the market. And we're going to see that they are being used more and more frequently. But we'll come back to these guys. We'll talk about them later. But if you ever do see treasury stock on a firm's balance sheet, right, you would see something like retained earnings, and that would be a positive number. You would see common stock, and that would be a positive number. And then you would see treasury stock, and that actually comes in as a negative number, right? Because if when I issue stock, it adds to the common stock account. Well, when I buy back that stock, it has to take away from that common stock account, right? So just like we have gross assets or gross property, plant, and equipment, and then we have accumulated depreciation and then net property, plant, and equipment, and we say that accumulated depreciation is a contra asset account, right? Because this is a positive number for gross PPE. Accumulated depreciation always reduces that, right? And then net PPE is another positive number for assets. It's a contra asset account for accumulated depreciation, right? Because it's opposite of what our normal assets are. I don't know if this is technically called a contra equity account. I don't know if I've ever heard it called that way for treasury stock, but I mean, basically it is, right? It's doing the same thing kind of that accumulated depreciation is doing. It's reducing the equity account to reflect the fact that the company has reclaimed some of its equity. All right, so that's why previously when we were talking about the payment date and everything and the declaration date, it says that on the declaration date, the retained earnings account, I'm sorry, that was for dividends. Just scratch what I just said. I just had a major brain fart. But what would actually happen if we want to think about the balance sheet correctly and not let Candy run off the rails there, is that you would end up having, like when we would do a repurchase, right, you would have a negative number in the treasury stock account. Well, how does that get balanced out? Your cash would go down, right? The cash account would decrease here. I shouldn't put a negative necessarily, but a decrease. And that would balance off the balance sheet if you think about the accounting of it, right? Because when I repurchase that stock, I got to repurchase it with something. And so I would give the shareholders cash, make my cash account go down, and that treasury stock account would increase, but increase as a negative number. So then overall, both my assets would go down and my equity would go down. If none of that made sense to you because you're not an accounting person, I apologize. But for those of us that are accounting people, sometimes it helps to think of like, well, what's the actual accounting transaction that would, occur with this, like what's actually happening to the firm's balance sheet when this transaction is executed. And that's basically what's happening. All right, we will come back to repurchases, but to finish off this little part of the chapter, I can put it all in one video, is that when we look at patterns of what firms have done in the past and what they are doing more of now, is that we have not really seen a change in the amount of distributions, the total amount of distributions. And make sure you realize that when we say distributions, again, that could mean two things. That can mean a cash dividend, or it could mean a repurchase. And so this total amount right here has not really changed. It says the total amount of payouts as a percentage of net income has been stable at about 26 to 28%, so about a quarter, let's say, of net income. But what we have seen is that dividend payout rates have fallen. So this guy has gone down, which means repurchases has gone up, because overall distributions haven't really changed, right? With the delta sign there, meaning change. Some stats from your book, but I mean, of course, you don't have to remember this. In 1974, the average dividend payout ratio was 22.3. It went to 13.8%, where repurchases have gone from 3.7 to 13.6. So there's definitely been a flip-flop, right? There's definitely been a shift in what firms prefer to do in order to distribute cash to shareholders. And now we actually have repurchases taking over dividends. That you're more likely as a shareholder to receive a cash distribution from a firm in the form of repurchase than in a dividend. And we'll see some reasons for that later on, why firms are kind of not afraid to pay dividends, but you got to make sure you can maintain a dividend or you get in trouble. Overall, we also see a smaller percentage of companies just paying dividends. So again, some stats from your book. In 1978, about 66% of firms on the New York Stock Exchange, American Stock Exchange, and NASDAQ paid a dividend. In 1999, only 20% paid a dividend. Right? That's a drastic reduction from 66% of firms to 20% of firms. That's a big reduction in the number of firms that, pay dividends. They explain part of this reduction by the large number of IPOs in the 1990s, because a lot of young firms typically are more likely to not pay a dividend, right? So if you have a large influx of young firms, you're going to automatically have a lower percentage of firms that are probably going to pay a dividend. But even the mature firms, we see them paying less dividends overall and fewer of them actually pursuing a dividend policy. When these young companies do first do a distribution, it's often in the form of a repurchase. So even when they start distributing cash to shareholders, it's not as a dividend, it's as a repurchase typically. And we see that dividend payouts have become more concentrated in these very large mature firms. So a much smaller proportion of firms that are paying out these funds to shareholders as dividends, which, as I'm guessing most of you are young people. Of course, I don't know that for sure, but most of my students are young people. That's actually a good thing for you, if you want to be a shareholder. And we'll talk about why when we talk about the clientele theory, which is one of the things we'll discuss when we go through all of our theories, which is coming up next. But just know those general trends, that repurchases have become the popular tool now to distribute cash to shareholders. Fewer companies are just distributing cash as dividends. And of, the firms that do pay out dividends, they're likely to be large, mature, very profitable firms who don't have anything else to do with their money. So why not pay a dividend? All right, we'll start in with our theories next, after we talk about setting up a distribution policy, and then we'll look at some alternative theories as to which distribution policy is correct.